There is a story inside Microsoft that almost nobody knows, and it did not happen once. It happened 3 times. The first time, it was a company called Netscape. They had 90% of the web browser market. They were the company that put the internet on your screen for the first time. They were gone inside 4 years. The second time, it was Novell. They owned one of the most popular word processors ever built, WordPerfect, and a network operating system that corporations around the world depended on. Their business lost $1.2 billion in value. They were forced to sell, and they eventually had to sue Microsoft to find out why. The third time, and this is the part that should concern you right now, the target is Linux, the free open source operating system that millions of people use to escape Microsoft Windows, the one that runs more than half the world's web servers. The one you may be thinking about switching to because you are fed up with what Microsoft has done to your computer. Here's the question you need to understand before this video is over. Is Microsoft doing to Linux exactly what it did to Netscape and Novell? And if so, how far along is that plan right now? Keep watching, because everything I am going to show you is documented. It happened in open court, and almost nobody covered it. And there is one specific moment from the Novell case, a moment that took place in a federal courtroom in Salt Lake City that tells you everything about how Microsoft actually operates. I will get to that moment later. It will change how you see everything Microsoft is doing today. Let us start with a number, 90%. In 1995, Netscape Navigator had 90% of the browser market. It was not just the most popular browser, it was essentially the only browser most people had ever used. The internet, as ordinary people experienced it, ran through Netscape. By 2002, Internet Explorer held 96% of the browser market. Netscape's share had collapsed to almost nothing. A company that once owned the gateway to the entire World Wide Web had been effectively destroyed in less than 7 years. That did not happen because Internet Explorer was better. It happened because Microsoft bundled Internet Explorer with every single copy of Windows. And Windows ran on more than 90% of the personal computers on Earth. You did not choose Internet Explorer. It was simply there when you turned on your computer. Netscape had to ask you to go and download it. Microsoft had already preloaded the competition. A senior Intel executive testified under oath during the antitrust trial that a Microsoft executive had described the strategy in plain terms: give away the browser for free, integrate it into Windows, and, in the words used at the time, cut off Netscape's air supply. Microsoft disputed the specific phrasing, but the strategy was not disputed, it was documented. Microsoft spent more than $100 million per year developing Internet Explorer, a product it gave away for free, because losing money on the browser meant protecting billions in Windows revenue. Novell's story is different in detail but identical in structure. WordPerfect was the dominant word processor before Microsoft Word existed. Novell alleged in federal court that Microsoft deliberately removed key technical interfaces from Windows 95 at the last minute, interfaces that WordPerfect depended on, without telling Novell. Novell said it was later forced to sell WordPerfect at a loss of $1.2 billion. Microsoft paid Novell $536 million to settle earlier antitrust claims. Then Novell turned around and sued again over WordPerfect, and now comes the Linux chapter, and this time the playbook does not look like a fight. It looks like a hug. That is what should worry you most. To understand what is happening with Linux today, you need to understand who Microsoft was at its most powerful, and what it was willing to do to stay there. Through the 1990s, Microsoft built its empire on a simple foundation. Windows ran on nearly every personal computer on Earth. It did not matter what software you wanted to use, you had to use Windows to get there. That gave Microsoft extraordinary leverage over every other software company in existence. If your product needed Windows to function, Microsoft could decide how well Windows supported it. The Department of Justice spent years investigating Microsoft before finally filing its antitrust lawsuit in May of 1998, joined by 20 state attorneys general. The case centered on one core allegation: Microsoft had used its Windows monopoly to crush competitors who posed a threat, not because those competitors had inferior products, but because Microsoft could not allow any alternative platform to gain enough strength to challenge Windows. Netscape was not just a browser company. Its Navigator browser was becoming a platform in its own right. If people could run applications through a browser rather than through Windows, they would not need Windows. That made Netscape an existential threat. The DOJ found evidence that Microsoft had attempted to divide the browser market with Netscape as early as 1995, essentially offering Netscape a deal not to compete. When Netscape refused, the destruction began. Novell's WordPerfect faced a different version of the same logic. It could run on operating systems other than Windows. If enough applications could run on alternatives to Windows, users had less reason to stay locked inside the Microsoft ecosystem. Novell alleged in court that Microsoft understood this and acted accordingly. Federal Judge Thomas Penfield Jackson ruled in 2000 that Microsoft had violated antitrust law, unlawfully maintaining its Windows monopoly and unlawfully tying Internet Explorer to it. He initially ordered the company broken up. That ruling was appealed. The breakup was overturned. In 2002, Microsoft settled without being split apart. A consent decree placed limits on its behavior, limits that expired in 2011. By the time that decree expired, Microsoft's most dangerous enemy was no longer Netscape or Novell. It was an operating system that no single company owned, that could not be bought, and that was spreading across the world's server infrastructure. It was Linux. And Microsoft's CEO at the time had already told the world exactly what he thought of it. In 2001, Steve Ballmer sat down with the Chicago Sun-Times and said this: "Linux is a cancer that attaches itself in an intellectual property sense to everything it touches." He was not speaking carelessly. He was speaking strategy. And what happened next is the part that almost nobody explains correctly. For a decade after Ballmer's cancer remark, Microsoft fought Linux the way it had fought Netscape and Novell, through pressure, patent threats, and litigation. Microsoft supported Eskio Group's copyright attack on Linux in the early 2000s, a legal campaign that threatened the entire open-source ecosystem. Microsoft made public claims that Linux violated unnamed Microsoft patents and used those claims to pressure Android device manufacturers, companies that built their products on the Linux kernel, into signing patent licensing agreements. Reports indicated Microsoft was collecting more revenue per Android device from those patent deals than it made from some of its own products. The strategy was familiar: attack the legal standing of Linux, make companies afraid to use it, keep enterprises loyal to Windows. Then something changed. The cloud happened. When Satya Nadella became CEO of Microsoft in February of 2014, he understood something his predecessors had not fully accepted. The future of computing was not on the desktop. It was in data centers, and those data centers ran Linux. Azure, Microsoft's cloud computing platform, was competing for enterprise customers who needed Linux support. Microsoft could not build a serious cloud business while treating Linux as the enemy. So Nadella stood up and said the three words that sent shockwaves through the technology world: Microsoft loves Linux. Microsoft joined the Linux Foundation. It began contributing code to the Linux kernel. It built the Windows subsystem for Linux, a tool that lets you run Linux software directly inside Windows. And in 2018, it acquired GitHub for $7.5 billion. GitHub is the largest platform on Earth for storing, sharing, and collaborating on open source code. It is where the Linux kernel itself lives. With one acquisition, Microsoft became the landlord of the open source world. And here is where the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. Because every move Microsoft made toward Linux followed the exact same three-phase strategy that antitrust investigators had documented from the Netscape era. Phase 1, embrace, extend. Phase 3, and this is what I want you to think about, extinguish. I will come back to what that third phase looks like today. But first, you need to understand what the escalation actually looks like from the inside. The phrase embrace, extend, extinguish was not invented by Microsoft's critics. It was documented by the Department of Justice. Internal Microsoft communications from the 1990s described a strategy of engaging with open internet standards, extending those standards with Microsoft-specific additions that competitors could not replicate, and then using those differences to make the original open versions obsolete. Watch what Microsoft has done with Linux through that lens. Embrace, Microsoft began contributing to the Linux kernel in 2009, initially focused on making Linux run better inside Azure's cloud infrastructure. Those contributions were real and technically substantive. Microsoft also began shipping Linux distributions through the Windows Store and made Linux tools part of the standard Windows developer experience. Extend, the Windows subsystem for Linux, now ships with a full Linux kernel inside Windows. Millions of developers who might have switched entirely to Linux can now get much of the Linux experience without leaving Windows. The reason to make the full switch becomes less obvious. In 2025, Microsoft went further, open-sourcing the Windows subsystem for Linux itself and releasing GitHub Copilot's client code under the MIT license. On the surface, these look like GIFs. Underneath, they deepen developer dependence on Microsoft's infrastructure. GitHub now hosts over 150 million developers. Every open-source project that lives on GitHub, including the Linux kernel, depends on Microsoft's servers, Microsoft's tools, and Microsoft's continued goodwill. When the Zig programming language project migrated away from GitHub in late 2025, it cost them access to more than $170,000 per year in GitHub sponsors' donations. They left anyway. That tells you exactly how much leverage GitHub now holds over open-source projects that depend on its donation infrastructure. GitHub Copilot, the AI coding assistant, trained on billions of lines of publicly available code, much of it open source, is now the most widely used AI tool among developers. A lawsuit filed in 2022 alleged that Copilot was trained on open-source code in ways that violated the licenses under which that code was shared. That case is still working through the courts. The question that everyone in the Linux and open-source community is now asking is whether any of this constitutes the third phase. And to answer that, honestly, you need to understand what the human cost of the first two destructions actually looked like. Because the people who lived through the Novell trial saw something that made it very hard to remain neutral. In the autumn of 2011, a federal courthouse in Salt Lake City became the stage for one of the most unusual legal dramas in the history of the technology industry. Novell was suing Microsoft for $1 billion. The company claimed that Microsoft had deliberately misled Novell's engineers into building a version of WordPerfect for Windows 95, promising access to technical interfaces that would give WordPerfect a prominent place in the new operating system, and had then removed those interfaces at the last minute without warning. Novell said this was not a technical accident, it was sabotage. To contest that claim, Microsoft put Bill Gates on the stand. For 2 days, the co-founder and architect of Microsoft's entire business sat in that courtroom and testified about decisions he made in the mid-1990s. Gates said he had no idea his decision to remove the technical interface in question would affect Novell. He said he had made the change to protect Windows 95 from outside code that could cause it to crash. He called WordPerfect in sworn testimony a bulky, slow, buggy product that did not integrate well with Windows. Novell's attorneys told a different story. They described Microsoft as having purposefully duped a Utah company, a company with more than 1,000 employees, that had acquired WordPerfect for nearly $1.5 billion, that had invested enormously in making its software work with Microsoft's new operating system, into a dead end. They called it, in closing arguments, a purely predatory action. The jury deadlocked. The judge dismissed the remaining claims after the jury failed to return a verdict. Novell appealed. The appeals court sided with Microsoft. The legal system produced no remedy. But the human reality was not abstract. WordPerfect had been the word processor of choice for lawyers, doctors, government agencies, and universities across the English-speaking world. The program that dominated word processing in the 1980s simply vanished from relevance. The people who had built careers at WordPerfect Corporation, who had worked inside Novell's software division, who had invested in those companies' stints, they experienced an outcome that the courts declined to call illegal, but that a jury of ordinary Americans could not unanimously agree was innocent. For the Windows users watching this video, people who remember a time when you could buy software from multiple competing companies, when no single corporation controlled your computing experience from the operating system to the browser to the Office suite, the Novell story is not ancient history. It is a template, and that brings us to the question that matters most right now. Is Linux next? Or has Microsoft genuinely changed? The honest answer is more complicated than either side wants to admit. Let us be fair about this, because your trust matters more than a tidy narrative. The case that Microsoft has genuinely changed rests on real evidence. The company that Satya Nadella runs is demonstrably different from the company Steve Ballmer described as fighting Linux to protect Windows revenue. Microsoft's contributions to the Linux kernel are technical, substantive, and ongoing. The open sourcing of .NET, PowerShell, the Windows subsystem for Linux, and GitHub Copilot's client code represent real work freely given. Azure runs Linux workloads at massive scale. A company that truly wanted Linux dead would not be one of its largest cloud hosts. Azure's business model also changes Microsoft's financial incentives in a fundamental way. In the 1990s, Linux was a threat because it competed with Windows on the desktop and in server rooms. Today, Microsoft makes money every time a Linux workload runs on Azure. The enemy has become the product. Destroying Linux would now hurt Microsoft's own revenue, but the case for concern is also built on real evidence. The embrace, extend, extinguish strategy is not a conspiracy theory. It is a documented historical pattern confirmed by federal courts. The acquisition of GitHub concentrated the world's open-source infrastructure inside a single corporation, one with an established history of using platform control against competitors. The fact that GitHub is currently well-run and developer-friendly does not change what it is, a dependency. And dependencies, as the Zig project's painful departure demonstrated, come with costs that only become visible when someone tries to leave. The GitHub Copilot lawsuit is not fringe litigation. It represents a substantive, unresolved question about whether the open-source community's decades of freely shared work can be commercially harvested without reciprocal obligation. That question has not been answered. The Windows subsystem for Linux may be exactly what it appears, a useful bridge for developers who need both ecosystems. Or it may be doing quietly what Internet Explorer did loudly, making it less necessary to choose a non-Microsoft platform by absorbing the competitor's best features directly into Windows. Here is what the historical record actually tells us. Microsoft has never been punished in a way that structurally changed its behavior. The 2002 settlement produced a consent decree. The consent decree expired. The behavior that federal courts found illegal in 2000 produced no breakup, no executive accountability, and no permanent structural remedy. Novell's billion-dollar case ended without a verdict. The pattern that repeated from Netscape to Novell was never interrupted, only concluded once the targets were already gone. Whether Linux survives with its independence intact will depend partly on whether the open-source community recognizes the playbook early enough to respond, and partly on whether this time the company at the center of the story has actually genuinely changed. We started this video with a number, 90%. Netscape's browser market share in 1995. That number matters because it tells you something important. Dominance is not protection. The most powerful position in a market can disappear inside a decade when the company that controls the operating system decides it wants what you have. Netscape learned that. Novell learned that. The open source community is now sitting with Linux running more than half the world's server infrastructure, watching a company that once called their operating system a cancer claim it now loves them. The question is not whether Microsoft is evil. The question is whether the structure of the technology industry allows any single company, no matter how well-intentioned its current leadership, to control the platform, the code repository, the developer tools, and the AI assistant that the entire software world depends on, without that concentration of power eventually being used. History says it does not. If this video changed how you see Microsoft, drop a comment below and tell me what surprised you most. Was it Netscape, Novell, or what is happening with Linux right now? And if you know someone who still thinks Microsoft plays fair, share this video with them. They need to see it. If this video helped you understand what is actually happening inside the technology industry, not the press release version, but the documented historical version, then subscribe. Not because there is more content, but because the story we started here is not finished, and the next chapter affects you directly.